I heard the applause before I saw anything. My name is Julian Whitmore, and I am 26 years old. I was in the back kitchen before dawn, wearing flour on my sleeves, when the sound came through the swinging door. I pressed it open just enough to look. There was my sister Vanessa, standing beside the display case like she owned the counter. Beside her stood Elliot Mercer, a food critic whose name I had only seen in print. On the counter between them sat my maple brown butter pear braid. I had spent months developing that recipe after the bakery nearly collapsed. I tested it 23 times while the rest of the family slept. I cried when the first perfect batch came out golden and fragrant because it felt like hearing my grandmother's voice. Now Vanessa was describing it to Elliot like she had created it herself. She talked about honoring our grandmother's legacy with something fresh. Every word was stolen. My father, Martin, stood nearby and said nothing. He had watched me test batch after batch for weeks. Then Elliot asked what made her toast the milk solids before folding them into the filling. Vanessa froze for half a second, then laughed and said she just followed instinct. I knew then she had no idea what that meant. Before I could step forward, Vanessa slipped into the kitchen and pulled the door almost shut behind her. Her voice was a low, sharp whisper. She told me I should not embarrass the family by coming out looking like a dishwasher. She said Elliot expected a face for the bakery, not someone awkward and covered in flour. I looked at my father, waiting for him to say something. Martin looked away and said Vanessa had already started the conversation and we should keep things simple. That hurt more than anything Vanessa said. I went back to the work table and tried to focus. My hands shook as I folded the dough. I kept thinking about the night this recipe finally worked, how I had stood alone in the kitchen at nearly 1 a.m. watching the braid come out of the oven, and how I had pressed my hands flat on the counter to stop them from trembling. Elliot stayed longer than expected. He kept asking questions Vanessa could not answer well. When she stumbled over what kind of pears I used, I heard myself speak before I fully decided to. I said it from the kitchen doorway. Bosc pears. Bartlett collapsed too quickly under heat. The front of the bakery went silent. Elliot turned toward the kitchen. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Elliot asked if I worked in the kitchen. Before I could answer, Vanessa jumped in and said I helped out sometimes, like I was a part-time volunteer instead of the person who kept the ovens running every single day. I felt the old shame rising, the kind my family had trained into me over years of being the quiet one in the back. I almost let Vanessa talk over me the way she always did. But Elliot was looking at me with a patient expression, like he already sensed something was off. He asked me why Bosc pears worked better. I answered clearly. They hold their shape under heat, stay fragrant, and do not flood the pastry with liquid the way Bartlett's do. The front of the bakery went still because my answer was confident and specific and unmistakably real. Elliot asked how many versions it took to get the filling right. Vanessa said a few. I said 23. Martin closed his eyes. Elliot smiled slightly and said that sounded like a story. Vanessa cut in loudly and announced they had customers waiting, gesturing toward the front door like she was dismissing both of us. Elliot thanked her and looked at me one more time before he left. He had the expression of someone writing something down in his head. After Elliot left, Vanessa turned on me in the kitchen. She accused me of trying to humiliate her in front of an important critic. I said she had humiliated herself by claiming work she did not do. Martin stepped between us and told me to let it go because the bakery needed good publicity and Vanessa was better at selling the dream. I asked him if I was only good enough to bake it. Nobody answered. That evening I reached for the blue recipe notebook I kept beside the large standing mixer. I used it to record every test batch, note, failure, and small adjustment going back to the beginning. It was gone from the drawer. I searched the kitchen, the storage shelves, the office, and the walk-in cooler. I found nothing. Then I noticed Vanessa's leather tote sitting behind the counter near the register. I unzipped it carefully. My notebook was inside. Before I could take it back, Vanessa appeared in the doorway. She said I should be careful because Martin might think I was stealing from the bakery. Her voice was steady and deliberate. I understood what she was doing. She was not just taking credit for my work. She was preparing to erase the evidence that the work had ever been mine. I refused to fight Vanessa alone where she could twist the story afterward. I waited until Martin was in the kitchen with us, then asked Vanessa calmly to return my notebook. Vanessa said it belonged to the bakery, not to me personally. I opened the notebook and turned to the first page. Taped inside was a yellowed recipe card written by our late grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore. In the corner of the card, in my grandmother's handwriting, were the words, "For Julian, because she listens to dough." Martin's expression softened when he saw his mother's writing. Vanessa said quickly that Grandma had given everyone recipes. I agreed, then said this one had been left unfinished, and that I had spent months developing it into something the bakery could actually sell. Martin still tried to calm everyone down instead of defending me. He said we could describe the recipe as a family effort going forward. I looked at him for a moment and understood that even clear proof was not enough when the people around me preferred the easier story. Then the bakery phone rang. Martin answered and his face changed. Elliot Mercer wanted to schedule a second visit. This time he was bringing a photographer. Vanessa became frantic after hearing about the second visit. She started practicing lines about her creative process and the family's baking legacy while I worked quietly beside her. She pulled me aside and asked for the full recipe method so she could answer technical questions if Elliot pushed. I told her no. I said the recipe belonged to the bakery, but I would not help her lie about creating it. She threatened to tell Martin I was being selfish and difficult. I walked away and started making copies of everything I had. Dated ingredient receipts, notebook pages, supplier orders, test batch logs, and photos of failed versions I had taken on my phone just for my own reference. I was not planning revenge. I was protecting myself. A young assistant baker named Mason noticed what I was doing. He came over quietly and told me he remembered watching me test the braid long before Vanessa ever mentioned it. I thanked him and told him not to take sides because I did not want to pull the staff into a family argument. Then Mason lowered his voice and told me something else. Vanessa had been telling the rest of the staff that I was unstable and jealous. She had been building her story before the second visit even arrived. I noticed the change in the kitchen immediately. The two counter girls stopped talking when I walked in. The dishwasher avoided my eyes. Vanessa had planted a version of me in their heads, someone bitter and difficult, someone who resented customers for preferring her sister. I felt isolated in the place that had always felt like home. But instead of defending myself out loud, I became quieter and more careful. I kept my head down, documented my hours, labeled my test batches, and wrote the time on every prep sheet I touched. The day of the second visit arrived. Elliot came with a photographer who carried a large bag of equipment. Vanessa stepped forward wearing a spotless apron she had never once worn in actual baking. She positioned herself near the work table and smiled broadly. Elliot asked her to demonstrate the lamination fold. The fold is specific, practiced, and physical. Vanessa placed both hands on the dough completely wrong. The photographer lowered his camera. I watched from the flour-dusted corner as Elliot's expression shifted. Then Vanessa turned and looked directly at me. She asked me sweetly to bring her the prepared dough. She wanted me to walk into the frame and rescue the lie she was performing on camera. I brought the dough over and set it on the table in front of her. I did not correct her or explain anything. I simply stepped back and let the moment be what it was. Vanessa tried to fold it and tore through the layers. Butter smeared across the surface. The dough warmed under her hands and began to slacken. I knew that batch was ruined. Martin rushed in and suggested the photographer take pictures of the finished pastries in the display case instead. Vanessa laughed too brightly and said the kitchen was too chaotic for staged photos today. Elliot said real kitchens usually were. Then he turned to me and asked if I could show the fold. The room went completely still. I looked at Martin. He had a chance to say something honest, something that would set the record straight in front of the photographer and the critic. He said nothing. So I washed my hands, dusted the table, and demonstrated the fold. The motion was quiet, practiced, and clean. The photographer raised his camera without being told. Vanessa stood to the side with her arms at her body. Elliot watched me work and then asked how long I had been baking. I said since my grandmother first put me on a stool beside this table. After Elliot left, Martin called me into the small back office. He said I needed to apologize to Vanessa for making her look foolish in front of the Critic. I stared at him before answering. I said Vanessa had looked foolish because she claimed skills she did not have. Martin admitted quietly that he knew I was the better baker. But then he said Vanessa was the reason customers walk through the door and that I should not create conflict when a feature might be coming. I asked why peace in this family always required me to disappear. He had no answer. That evening I sat in my car in the parking lot and listened to an old voicemail I had saved from my grandmother. Her voice was warm and unhurried. She said one day they would know what I could do and that I should not let anyone make me small before that day came. I played it twice. Then I made a decision. I would not sabotage Vanessa or embarrass the bakery. But I would no longer protect the lie. The next morning I asked my father for a written role agreement. He stared at me like I had said something in a foreign language. I asked Martin for 3 things. First, my name attached to the maple brown butter pear braid as the recipe developer. Second, a written acknowledgement of my role in creating it. Third, a formal kitchen manager title with pay that matched what the job actually was. Vanessa reacted as if I had asked for the building. She said family businesses do not need contracts and that only greedy people put legal language between relatives. I told her that family businesses needed honesty most of all. Martin said he would think about it. I recognized that answer. It was the same one he gave whenever he wanted time to hope the problem went away. Then the bakery received an email from Elliot. His review would run in 3 weeks. He needed final confirmation of the baker's name for the piece. Vanessa told Martin they should list her name because customers already associated her face with the pastry. She said it would be better for the brand. I listened to that and then said one sentence. I told them to go ahead and send my resignation along with it. The kitchen went cold. Martin looked at me the way he had not looked at me in years. For the first time since this started, he was scared. Martin begged me not to quit. He promised things would be resolved, but he still would not confront Vanessa directly. I took 2 scheduled days off with written notice and left the kitchen stocked with everything needed for standard recipes. I did not leave the special braid filling prepared. Vanessa decided to prove she could manage without me. She attempted the braid on her own. The filling leaked through the layers. The edges burned while the center stayed raw. Customers who had ordered the pastry complained when they picked up their boxes. Vanessa blamed the humidity, the flour brand, the oven calibration, and finally Mason. Mason refused to accept it. He told Martin calmly that Julian's method included specific resting times between steps and that Vanessa had skipped them entirely. Martin stood in the kitchen surrounded by unsellable pastries and said nothing for a long time. He finally understood that the bakery could not produce its most important item without me. But rather than apologizing, Vanessa made a different move. She called a local baking consultant named Helen Marks and told her that I had stolen the recipe from an old Whitmore family file. I received a message from Helen asking for my version of the story. I agreed to meet Helen Marks at a coffee shop near the bakery. I brought everything with me. My grandmother's unfinished recipe card, all 23 dated test versions with written notes, the ingredient receipts organized by date, and the supplier orders showing exactly when each component was purchased. Helen was experienced and fair. She spent about 30 minutes reviewing everything without saying much. Then she looked up and told me clearly that the work was mine. The original card was an idea and a starting point. What I had developed was something entirely different and sellable. Then Helen told me something Vanessa had not expected her to share. Vanessa had not contacted her for advice. Vanessa had called to see whether Helen would write a statement saying the recipe belonged to the bakery brand and not to any individual developer. Helen had refused because she had not yet verified anything. I thanked her and started to gather my papers. Helen stopped me and said one more thing. She warned that if Elliot's review became widely read, Vanessa would likely try to use my work to secure business opportunities. That warning came true faster than I expected. I drove back past the bakery and heard Vanessa through the open side window discussing a wholesale deal for her signature pastry. Vanessa came home that evening excited about a trial order with a boutique grocery chain. Martin lit up immediately and said this kind of deal could clear their remaining debt. I asked practical questions. Did they have enough staff for the volume? Was the oven capacity sufficient? Did they have a quality control process in place? Vanessa laughed and said I was always negative about progress. I told her I was not against growth. I was against promising what they could not deliver. She cut me out of the planning and told the grocery buyer she would personally oversee the recipe. I wrote a professional memo to Martin outlining the production risks and kept a copy for myself. I said nothing more. The trial order day arrived and everything moved too fast. Dough was pulled from rest too early. Filling was measured by eye instead of weight. Boxes were mislabeled with the wrong variety names. I stood near the prep counter and watched the disaster forming shape by shape. I offered to help if Vanessa would slow the process and follow the correct steps. She pointed toward the far side of the kitchen and told me to stay in my corner. By noon, half the order was unusable. The grocery buyer arrived ahead of schedule and noticed immediately that the pastries were inconsistent. Some were pale and soft, others overdone. Vanessa stepped forward and began talking warmly about the bakery's family history and vision. The buyer listened politely, then asked directly who had developed the production method. Vanessa said she had. Mason was standing near the prep station. He had stayed quiet for months while I was erased. This time he spoke. He said Julian had. The kitchen froze. The buyer turned and looked at me. She asked whether the order could still be saved. I checked the remaining dough, the oven timing, and usable inventory. I told her we could rescue part of it if everyone followed my instructions. For the first time in a long while, the whole kitchen listened to me. I reorganized the workflow, adjusted the bake schedule, and salvaged enough pastries to prevent a full cancellation. Before she left, the buyer pulled Martin aside and said I was the only reason she was still willing to continue the conversation at all. That evening Martin suspended me from the kitchen until things cooled down. He sent it as a text message, 3 sentences long, like it was nothing. I arrived at the bakery at 4:30 the following morning and found the kitchen code had been changed. My key no longer opened the back door. I stood in the cold and recognized the feeling. It was another quiet way of erasing me from the place I had kept running. Vanessa opened the inner door and said Martin had decided I needed time away. She said the bakery would be fine without me. I did not argue or beg. I sent Martin a written message asking him to confirm in writing that I was suspended and no longer responsible for production quality during that time. He confirmed it within the hour. That confirmation became more important than he realized. During my suspension, Vanessa attempted to continue making the braid. Quality dropped within 2 days. Regular customers began commenting. Several catering orders were delayed or refunded. Then Elliot Mercer's review was published. It praised the pastry at length. But near the end was a single sentence that changed everything. He had written that the quiet baker behind it, Julian Whitmore, worked with the restraint and memory of someone preserving more than a recipe. I heard that Vanessa read it several times and did not take it well at all. The review brought a wave of new customers to the bakery. But they came in asking for Julian by name. Vanessa told them I was taking a short break. Some asked when I would be back. Others left without buying anything. Martin called me several times that first week. I replied once, in writing, and asked whether my title, pay, and recipe credit would be corrected and formalized before I returned. He said we could discuss it when I came back. I said no. I would not return first and negotiate later. The bakery became increasingly difficult to manage without me. Vanessa gave 2 short interviews to small local outlets and tried to redirect attention toward herself, but both articles referenced Elliot's line about me. Then Elliot called me directly. He said he had been invited to host a regional food event and wanted me to present my pastry as part of a local heritage baking panel. I was completely still for a moment after he said it. That evening, Martin mentioned the invitation to Vanessa. She told him the family should decline unless she could represent the bakery in my place. I heard about it through Mason. I picked up my phone and called Elliot's event coordinator before Vanessa could act. I explained to the event coordinator that the bakery was in a family disagreement and asked whether I could attend independently. The coordinator told me the invitation had been extended because of my craft, not the bakery's name or its politics. I accepted on my own behalf. When Vanessa found out, she called it a betrayal. I told her I was finally separating my work from her performance. At the event I brought two things: my grandmother's original recipe card and my test notebook. I spoke honestly and without drama. I talked about the unfinished card, the months of testing, and what it meant to develop something that tasted like a memory while still being entirely new. The audience responded in a way I had not fully prepared for. They were quiet and attentive in the way people get when something feels genuinely real to them. Then, while I was still on stage for the panel discussion, Martin called me. I let it ring. Afterward, Mason sent me a text. The grocery chain had withdrawn its trial offer because Vanessa had misrepresented the bakery's production capacity in her original pitch. The deal I had warned Martin about had collapsed exactly the way I said it would. The failed grocery deal left a visible mark. Local vendors heard about it and the bakery's credibility dropped. The review had brought customers in, but inconsistent quality was pushing them back out. I still cared about the bakery because my grandmother had built it and my best memories lived inside it. But I no longer trusted my family with my future. I had started working part-time at a farm-to-table cafe run by a former customer named Clara Ellis, who had always noticed my work and once told me my pastries tasted like someone who took time seriously. Clara gave me prep space and let me develop seasonal items under my own name. For the first time I understood what it felt like to be recognized without having to fight for it first. Back at the bakery, Vanessa launched a new pastry she called a cranberry cream twist and announced it as her own creation. Customers were polite but unenthusiastic. Staff made quiet jokes that Vanessa could name things but could not bake them. Then an elderly regular came into Clara's cafe, recognized me across the room, and said my grandmother would have been proud of me. I held on to that sentence for days. I entered a regional heritage baking competition using my own name, not the bakery's. My entry was built on my grandmother's unfinished notes but fully and honestly developed by me. I told Martin before the announcement went public because I refused to be secretive about it. He said competing separately would embarrass the bakery. I said the bakery had embarrassed itself by refusing to credit the person doing the actual work. Vanessa entered the competition too, representing Whitmore's half. The local baking community noticed the dynamic immediately. Two sisters, one family legacy, one public table. I prepared carefully during early mornings at Clara's cafe. I kept everything documented, clean, and honest. Vanessa, meanwhile, tried to get my updated notes through Mason. She asked him twice in 1 week. Mason refused both times and then came to me and said he was done. He quit the bakery the next day and joined my preparation team at Clara's. The night before the competition, I received a message through the organizer's contact system. Someone had filed a complaint claiming my recipe belonged to Whitmore's hearth and that I was competing with property that was not mine. I sat with that message for a long time. Then I opened my notebook and started organizing my documents for the morning. I arrived at the competition early. I brought my notebook, every dated draft, the original ingredient receipts, my grandmother's recipe card, and a written statement from Helen Marks confirming I had developed the final recipe independently from an unfinished family document. Vanessa arrived later, polished and prepared for an audience. Martin came with her and stood near the registration table looking uncertain. The organizers reviewed the ownership complaint quietly before the event began. I presented my documents without emotion and without naming Vanessa directly. She told the organizer I was weaponizing paperwork against my own family. I said I was protecting work that someone kept trying to wear like a costume. The organizers allowed me to compete under my own name. During judging, Vanessa's pastry looked beautiful from a distance, golden and well-shaped. But when the judges tasted it, their response was polite and brief. Mine took considerably longer to evaluate. Elliot Mercer was one of the guest judges. After tasting my entry he paused, set his fork down slowly, and asked whether I had changed the salt level from the bakery version. I said yes. Vanessa's eyes went wide across the room. She had not known there had been any change at all. The finalists were asked to explain the personal story behind their recipe. Vanessa went first and gave a smooth, practiced speech about sisterhood and legacy and carrying their grandmother's dream forward. It was well delivered and people responded warmly. Then it was my turn. I did not attack her. I spoke plainly. I said my grandmother had left an unfinished note, the bakery had nearly failed, I had tested the recipe 23 times, and I had learned something unexpected during that process. I said that love without credit can become another kind of silence. The room was very still after I said that. Elliot asked Vanessa a technical question about her version of the braid. He asked why she had chosen the butter temperature she used. Vanessa hesitated and gave an answer that was vague and circular. Elliot turned to me and asked the same question. I answered with specific numbers and a clear reason. The judges understood the difference without needing it explained further. When the winner was announced, it was my name they called. Vanessa clapped with a fixed smile. Backstage she found me and said the win meant nothing because the family bakery still owned the public story. I told her that would change after tomorrow. Elliot published a follow-up piece the following week. It was not gossip. It was a serious article about craft, invisible labor, and what it means to credit the people behind food that becomes beloved. He wrote about my grandmother's influence, my months of testing, and the quiet unfairness that small family businesses sometimes build into their structures. He never named Vanessa as a villain. He did not need to. The article made clear, through specific detail, that I was the baker behind the recipe that had revived Whitmore's half. Customers asked why I was no longer working there. A handful of regulars stopped buying the braid at the bakery, saying it no longer tasted the same. Martin came to Clara's cafe on a Thursday afternoon and sat across from me at a small table near the window. He asked me to come home to the bakery. I asked whether Vanessa had admitted the truth to the staff and the public. He said she was not ready to do that. I looked at him and said that then neither was I. He sat with that for a moment. I watched him understand, finally, that he had lost the daughter who kept waiting for him to do what was right. Whitmore's hearth continued losing ground. Catering orders fell away one by one. Customers who had followed my work came to Clara's cafe instead. Vanessa could not hold the bakery's reputation together on presentation alone. One evening after Clara's closed, Vanessa came and found me cleaning the prep counter. She did not look polished. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. She said the bakery might not survive the month. I waited for an apology. Instead she said family helps family and that I should come back. I asked if family also takes family's work and presents it as their own. She broke a little then. She admitted she had been jealous for a long time. I had our grandmother's hands and her instincts, and customers trusted food that came from genuine skill. Taking credit had felt easy because everyone already looked at her first. I listened to all of it. Then I told her she was sorry she had been exposed, not sorry she had hurt me. There was a real difference between those two things. She looked at the floor and laughed bitterly. Then Martin walked through the door behind her, looked at both of us, and said I was right. Martin sat down with us and we talked for close to an hour. At the end of it I agreed to a limited consulting arrangement to stabilize Whitmore's half. I would not return as the invisible backroom daughter. The written terms were clear. My name would be formally credited as the developer of the maple brown butter pear braid. I would be paid fairly for every consulting hour. The staff would be trained under my documented method. And Vanessa would be removed from all claims of recipe development going forward. Martin signed that evening. Vanessa sat with the agreement for 2 days before she signed as well. I think she realized there was no other rescue coming that did not involve me. I trained the new assistant baker, reorganized the recipe files, and restored quality steadily enough for the bakery to survive the season. I did not share my competition recipe. That one was mine and stayed mine. The bakery updated its printed menu and the small framed card beside the display case. It now read, Maple Brown Butter Pear Braid, developed by Julian Whitmore from Eleanor Whitmore's original notes. Regular customers noticed immediately and several said something to Vanessa directly at the counter. Months after the agreement was signed, Clara offered me the position of pastry director at her cafe, which was expanding into a dedicated bakery kitchen. I accepted. The space was mine to run properly, from sourcing to schedule to the names on every recipe. My pastries sold out each weekend. Not because of drama or a rivalry people were watching, but but because the food was genuinely good and people could taste that it was made by someone who cared about every layer. Martin visited Clara's cafe regularly. We rebuilt something slowly, through conversations that did not make excuses and through actions that showed he understood what he had allowed to happen. He told me once that he had mistaken Vanessa's confidence for leadership and my quietness for contentment. I told him that was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. Vanessa remained at Whitmore's hearth in the role she had always actually been suited for. The customer-facing side. The ordering. The social presence. She was no longer permitted to claim what she had not created. Elliot visited my new kitchen one afternoon and tasted my latest pastry. He asked what I called it. I smiled and told him it was the one I made for myself.